A burned bunkhouse roared in the bright Montana summer, a wounded Navy SEAL pinned beneath a beam, two workers trapped behind the flames. A young FBI agent fought to reach him, but the smoke swallowed everything. Then her German shepherd broke every command he'd ever learned and lunged into the fire. What that dog dragged her toward would expose a dead child's stolen name and a town's smiling lie. If you believe God still sends help into the smoke, leave amen. By the time summer reached Larkspur, the whole town smelled of ripe cherries and cold lake water. The orchards on the slopes above Cobalt Lake hung heavy with fruit, dark red and glossy, and the morning light came down off the mountains so clean it made the water look like poured glass. Tourists drifted along the waterfront in sandals and sun hats. A farmer's market had spread itself across Main Street with folding tables of jam, honey, late strawberries, and hand-lettered signs promising the best pie in 3 counties. Banners for the Cherry Festival snapped overhead in a breeze that carried no warning in it at all. It was the kind of bright northern morning that made a place look innocent, and Larkspur wore that innocence the way a clean tablecloth hides the scratches in old wood. Jessica Ward drove into all of it with one window down and a thin manila folder on the passenger seat. She was 28, lean and quick-eyed, with dark hair pulled back so tightly it looked like a decision rather than a style. Her skin had the pale, indoor tone of someone who spent more hours under fluorescent lights than sun, and there was a watchfulness in her face that never fully switched off, a habit of measuring rooms and exits that had started long before the Bureau ever trained it into her. She did not look like a woman who frightened easily. She looked like a woman who had decided years ago that fear was a luxury she could not afford. In the back seat, riding upright like he had paid for the ticket, sat Rin. Rin was a German shepherd, 3 years old, black and tan with a deep saddle of darker fur across his back and a chest that had filled out into something powerful in the last year. His ears stood tall and restless, swiveling at every new sound, and his eyes were a steady amber brown that gave strangers the uneasy sense of being read rather than watched. Jessica had found him at a week old, a runt abandoned in a cardboard box behind a gas station the same gray week her father died, and she had bottle-fed him through nights she could not otherwise have survived. She had trained him herself, scent work and tracking, until a handler at Quantico signed off and the Bureau let her keep him close. People called him her partner and meant it as a figure of speech. Jessica had stopped correcting them. Rin had a way of leaning his weight against her leg in elevators, in morgues, in the long silences after bad days, that no human partner had ever managed. The folder on the seat was almost insulting in its thinness. A single identity theft complaint forwarded down through 3 desks until it landed on hers because she was new and someone had to take the small, ugly things. An old woman named Ruth Castellano had written to say that her son, Danny, dead 2 years now, was somehow earning wages at a business in Larkspur, Montana. Social Security had a record. The IRS had a record. Everyone had a record except the boy, who had none, being gone. Her supervisor, SAC Daniel Okonkwo, had been blunt about it over the phone that morning, his voice carrying the tired patience of a big man who had learned to conserve his energy. Close it, Ward. Verify, document, refer it out, drive home. Don't build a cathedral out of a parking ticket. She had said yes, sir, and meant it mostly. 3 miles east, in a cherry orchard owned on paper by a company called Summit Labor Solutions, Caleb Mercer was loading crates he could not quite feel the weight of. He was 36 and looked older in the bones, a tall man whose body had been built for something and then broken halfway through the building. His left leg ended in a hitch that turned every step into a small negotiation, and his hearing on one side had gone to a high constant ring after the blast, so that he turned his head a particular way to listen, like a man always half expecting bad news from over his shoulder. His face was hard-angled and sunburned, a few days of stubble going gray at the jaw, and his eyes had the flat, careful distance of a man who had learned that hope was just disappointment that hadn't arrived yet. He did not talk to the other workers much. He slept in a crowded bunkhouse at the edge of the orchard, 11 men to a room built for 4, under a cheerful sign at the gate that read, "We hire heroes," in white letters. In the breast pocket of his work shirt he kept one small worn thing, a dog's identification tag gone smooth at the edges from his thumb, stamped with a name that was not Wren and not his own. He took it out sometimes when the ringing got loud. He had stopped letting himself think the name attached to it. Thinking the name was how the bad night started. Jessica's first stop in town was the Blue Heron, a narrow cafe on the waterfront, run by a woman named Bertie Kessler. Bertie was somewhere near 70, small and round-shouldered, with silver hair she pinned up out of habit and a flour-dusted apron she wore like a uniform she had earned. Her husband had been a logger and a Korea veteran, dead a decade, and she had the particular sturdiness of women who have buried people and kept the lights on anyway. She set a coffee in front of Jessica without being asked and looked at the folder, then at the dog waiting patiently by the door, and decided she approved of at least one of them. When Jessica asked carefully about Summit Labor and a man named Garrett Vance, Bertie's mouth tightened a fraction. "Mister?" "Vance saved this town, depending who you ask," she said, wiping the counter in slow circles. "Gave folks jobs when the mill closed. Sponsors the veteran supper every fall. Gets his picture taken doing it, too." She slid a wrapped slice of cherry pie across the counter. "That one's for the fellow with the bad leg. If you see him out at the orchard, tell him it got burnt on the edge, and I'd be embarrassed to sell it." It had not been burnt anywhere. Jessica understood that this was how kindness moved in a town like this, quietly, with a cover story, so no one had to feel the weight of being helped. Then the light changed. A column of black smoke punched straight up over the orchard road, sudden and wrong, against all that bright blue, and a half-second later the sound reached town. A low, collapsing whump that wasn't thunder, that made every gull on the waterfront lift at once, and made the market crowd go still, mid-sentence, with cones of ice cream melting in their hands. For one suspended breath, nobody moved. A child somewhere asked a question that no adult answered. The water of Cobalt Lake kept lying there, flat and innocent, reflecting a sky that had just turned to ash at one edge. And in that small, frozen moment, Jessica felt the old animal's certainty drop into her stomach before her mind caught up. Something was burning. Someone was inside it. She was already moving, folder forgotten, Wren's lead in her fist, the dog matching her stride, before she had consciously decided to run. The orchard road climbed fast. By the time she reached the bunkhouse, the structure was half gone, flames chewing through a long, low building, while a dozen workers stood in the dirt, yelling in 2 languages, and the air had that chemical sweetness of melting wiring underneath the wood smoke. A man in a stained ball cap and greased dark clothes, the foreman by the way the others looked at him, was shouting for everyone to stay back and waving his arms as though motion alone could organize a disaster. Jessica scanned faces, counting the way training had drilled into her, and that was when Wren stopped obeying her. The dog lunged, not the controlled pull of scent work, but something deeper and wilder, the lead burning across her palm as he wrenched toward the worst of the smoke, a low, continuous growl rolling out of his chest that she had never heard from him in 3 years. She called his name, gave the recall command in the flat tone he had never once ignored, and he ignored it. He hauled her sideways past the foreman, past the men, toward the collapsed end of the building where a section of roof had caved and the smoke ran thickest. She had 2 choices in that instant and no time to weigh them, so she trusted the dog because the dog had pulled her out of darker places than this. Around the corner of the burning wall, half under a fallen beam, lay a man. He was big and badly hurt, his shirt scorched across one shoulder, his leg twisted at a wrong angle beneath the timber, and he had dragged 2 coughing workers clear before the beam took him down, their bodies still half shielded by his. Jessica got the beam levered up with a length of pipe and her whole weight, while neighbors finally surged in to help. The man's eyes were open, gray and distant, fixed on nothing, And Rin, who had hauled her here through fire and command and every rule she had ever taught him, did not bark, did not lunge, did not circle. He folded himself down into the dirt against the wounded man's side and pressed close, the way he pressed against her leg in the worst silences, as though he had finally reached the thing he had been pulling toward all along, as though he had known this stranger his entire life. Later, after the volunteer crew had soaked the ruin black and a tired captain had written the words "electrical fault," overloaded circuit on his clipboard and called it an accident, Jessica knelt beside the man as they waited for the ambulance and gently worked open his clenched right hand. A laminated employee badge lay in his palm, edges curled and bubbled from the heat, but the photo and the name still legible. She read the name twice. It was not his face on the badge. It was not the name of any worker she had just interviewed in that smoke-stunned yard. It was the name of someone else entirely, and a cold thread pulled tight through her, because she had the sudden, certain feeling that whoever this name belonged to was not alive to be carrying it. Larkspur General was less a hospital than a clinic that had grown a second story out of stubbornness, 18 beds and a single overworked wing that smelled of antiseptic and lake damp. Caleb Mercer surfaced in one of those beds in the gray hour before noon, and the first thing he did was try to find the exits. His eyes moved before the rest of him could, sweeping the room corner to corner, cataloging the IV pole, the door, the window latch, the distance to each, with the automatic arithmetic of a man whose body had decided long ago that waking up was a tactical problem. Then the pain arrived and reorganized everything. His shoulder was wrapped, his bad leg splinted and elevated, and the constant high ring in his deaf ear had been joined by a duller throb behind his eyes. A nurse came to check his lines, and he flinched from her hands, not violently, just a hard, instinctive withdrawal, the way an animal that has been handled badly pulls back from even a gentle reach. Jessica had been there since dawn, sitting in the corner chair with the folder she was supposed to have closed already balanced on her knee. She watched him come back to himself and recognized with a tightness in her chest she did not want to name the particular way he was lost. She had seen it before. When she finally spoke, keeping her voice low and even, she asked simple things. His name, the date, where he worked. He gave her his name after a pause that lasted a beat too long, as if he had to go looking for it. The date he got wrong by 2 years, said it with total confidence, then watched her face and corrected himself in a flat voice that had learned not to be surprised by its own gaps. "Sometimes the years come unstuck," he said, and offered no apology for it. When she asked what he remembered about the fire, he said he remembered the smoke had a taste, and 2 men who weren't getting up, and after that, nothing useful. He did not ask if the 2 men had lived. Jessica understood that he was afraid of the answer, and that fear was the most human thing he had shown her yet. She had not planned what happened next. Rin had been waiting in the truck, but the morning had stretched long, and the dog got anxious alone, so she brought him up on his lead, meaning only to let him settle at her feet. The moment Rin came through the door, something changed in the room's air. The dog's ears came up, his whole body orienting toward the bed with a stillness Jessica had only ever seen in him on a live track. And then he crossed the floor slow and deliberate and put his head against the side of the mattress. And Caleb Mercer, who had pulled away from a nurse's hands an hour before, reached out without hesitation and laid his palm on the dog's skull, and his face came apart. "Argo," he said, and the word broke in the middle. He said it again, softer, the way you say a thing to keep it from being true. For a moment, he was not in a clinic in Montana at all. The heart monitor beside the bed stuttered, one long electronic note climbing as his pulse spiked, and in the bright square of window light, the dust hung suspended over a man's shaking hand on a dog's head, and neither Jessica nor the nurse in the doorway moved or breathed, because there are moments a body recognizes before the mind does, and the whole room understood at once that something was being grieved here that had been carried a very long way in silence. Then the monitor settled. Caleb's breathing slowed. the light went ordinary again, and into that quiet he began, in pieces, to tell her. The dog's real name was Argo, a Belgian Malinois, his partner across 3 deployments. There had been a building and a bad entry and a decision that was his to make, and no time to make it well. The blast had taken his leg and most of his hearing and all of Argo, and he had come home to a wife named Hannah, who had waded through everything, only to find that the man who returned was a stranger wearing her husband's face. He did not describe what came after in detail. He said the marriage didn't survive the man I turned into, and that Hannah was gone now, and the way he said gone closed the subject like a door. He had drifted west after that, job to job, town to town, until a sign that said, "We hire heroes," had felt less like a welcome and more like the only thing in the country willing to use that word about him without a question mark. Jessica wrote none of it down. Some testimony you took with your hands in your lap. Bertie Kessler arrived a little after 2 with a thermos and an opinion. The small woman bustled in, trailing the smell of coffee and cherry, set the thermos on the tray table, and informed Caleb that the pie he never got was now a casualty of the fire, and he owed her nothing because debts to Dead Pie were not collectible. It startled a sound out of him that was almost a laugh, the first crack of light in his gray face. While she fussed, she talked, and Jessica listened, because Bertie talking was better intelligence than any database. Garrett Vance had come to Larkspur 8 years back when the mill closed and the town was bleeding its young people south, and he had brought jobs, real ones, orchard contracts, and resort work, and a labor company that placed people all over the valley. "Folks light candles for that man," Bertie said, not quite warmly. "He stands up at the veterans' supper every fall and reads names, and everybody cries and writes him checks." She nodded at Caleb. "This one washed in about a year ago, quiet as the lake in January, took the worst shifts, never made trouble, never made friends. I fed him because somebody ought to." She said it the way she'd say anything true and uncomfortable, briskly, so it couldn't sit on anyone too heavy. When the room emptied and the afternoon went gold against the window, Jessica found herself talking, which she rarely did. Maybe it was the dog still leaning into the bed. Maybe it was the man who didn't pretend to be whole. She told Caleb how she'd gotten Rin. 3 years ago, the week her father died. Her father had been a soldier too, a long time ago, and he had come home from his own war carrying something that never set down its weight, and over the years it had hollowed him out from the inside until one gray morning he had simply stopped, the way a clock stops, and she had not been able to reach him in time, no matter how fast she drove. 4 days after the funeral, behind a gas station off the interstate, she'd heard a sound from a taped-up box in the weeds. A litter, abandoned. All gone but one, a week old, too small to have a chance. She had not been able to save her father. She had been, that night, exactly capable of saving one runt of a dog. "I bottle-fed him every 2 hours," she said. "Honestly, I think he saved me back." She looked at Rin, pressed warm against the side of a broken stranger, and did not finish the thought out loud, but it sat there in the room anyway, that the same dog had now hauled her through fire and disobedience toward this particular wreck of a man, as if he had been bred and bottle-fed and trained for no other purpose. It was full dark before she got back to the motel, and she set the burned employee badge on the desk under the lamp to photograph it for the file. Rin would not let it alone. The dog rose from the floor and came to the desk and put his nose to the laminate, working it, and a low, uneasy sound started in his throat, not the fire growl from the orchard, but something more troubled, more curious. Jessica picked the badge up and smelled it herself, and underneath the char she found what the dog had found. Layers. Diesel and engine grease, the chemical bite of orchard pesticide, the clean perfume starch of commercial laundry, the kind used on resort uniforms. And under all of it, faint and overlapping, the salt of more than one person's sweat. This badge had not belonged to one man. It had ridden in more than one pocket, through more than one job, passed hand to hand like a tool that didn't care whose hand held it. She opened her laptop and ran the name on the badge through the databases she was authorized to touch, expecting a living worker, a misfiled hire, an easy thread to snip. The name came back. It belonged to a boy who had been 11 years old when he died, 3 states away, 6 years ago. Jessica sat very still in the lamplight while the air conditioner ticked, and Rin watched her face the way he did when he knew before she said it. Someone in Larkspur was wearing a dead child's name to work. The thin folder Okonkwo had told her to close was not a parking ticket. It was the edge of something with a body count, and she had just put her hand on it. Ruth Castellano lived in a tidy double-wide on the south edge of Larkspur, where the orchards gave way to scrub and the rent stayed cheap. She was past 70, small and upright as a fence post, with a cloud of white hair set in tight curls and reading glasses she wore on a beaded chain so she could let them drop to her chest for emphasis, which she did often. Her skin was brown and deeply lined, her hands knuckled with arthritis but steady, and she met Jessica at the door with the unimpressed expression of a woman who had outlived most of the people who ever tried to manage her. She had been a county clerk for 31 years before she retired. She knew what paper could do to a person better than most lawyers did. She sat Jessica at a kitchen table, covered in a plastic cloth printed with sunflowers, and set down, one by one, the evidence of her grief. The letter from the IRS, addressed to a man 2 years in the ground, the wage statements, and a framed photograph of Danny at maybe 19, grinning under a backwards cap. "He died in a rollover outside Missoula," Ruth said, tapping the photo once with a bent finger. "I buried him. I picked the casket. I know exactly where my boy is." She folded her hands. "And then the government starts mailing him job offers and tax bills like he just stepped out for cigarettes." Her voice did not shake, but something behind her eyes did, and when she spoke again, it came out low and certain in a way that put a cold finger straight down Jessica's spine. "A child can die twice, Agent Ward, once when the Lord takes him, and once more when somebody picks his name up off the ground and wears it to work." Jessica had read 1,000 pages of case file in her career, and not one of them had said it that cleanly. Ruth pushed the whole pile across the sunflower cloth. "Take all of it. I've had it memorized for 2 years anyhow." Then she squared her shoulders and announced that she would, of course, be coming along to confront whoever did this, because she had survived 2 husbands, a hip replacement, and the cafeteria at the senior center, and a man behind a desk did not frighten her. It took Jessica 10 careful minutes and a promise to report back to talk her out of it. "Fine," Ruth said at last, wounded and regal, "but I'm not a houseplant." "Don't treat me like one." Back at the motel, Jessica spread it all out and let the shape of the thing rise up out of the paper. 2 patterns running side by side. The first used the dead, names like Danny Castellano and the 11-year-old boy on the burned badge. People with clean records and no living claim to their own identities were being attached to vulnerable workers, immigrants and drifters who could not complain, so their wages could be hidden, their hours laundered, their existence erased from the books, even as their labor filled the orchards. The second pattern used the living, and it was uglier for being legal on its face. Summit hired disabled veterans under that bright "We Hire Heroes" banner. Men like Caleb then inflated their reported wages far beyond what anyone actually got paid, because the federal tax credits for hiring a disabled veteran scaled with the wages on the books. Pay a man $100, report $9,000, pocket the credit and the difference. The dead hid the money. The heroes minted it. Garrett Vance had built a machine that ran on people nobody would miss. She drove out to see Caleb the next morning and found him sitting up, more present than the day before, the swelling down around his eyes. Rin went to him first, as Rin always did now, and Jessica had come to understand that the dog was the password. Caleb talked to her because the dog had vouched for her in a language older than either of them. In low pieces, looking mostly at Rin, he told her what he had watched from the inside of the bunkhouse for a year. How a man's papers got held for safekeeping the first day and never came back. How nobody walked to town because there was always a reason you couldn't, a shift, a debt, a ride that never came. How they'd load a crew into a van and the same faces would turn up a week later in resort housing across the valley, and then back in the orchard. Like they were rotating tools, he said, not people. And then, quieter, a name. Tomas Reyes. A young guy, kept his head down, but one night by the water spigot he'd told Caleb he was going to find a way to talk to somebody from the government, that he had things to say. That was about 10 days ago, Caleb said. I haven't seen him since. A van door slammed somewhere out in the orchard rows, a single flat metal bang that rolled across the water and came back off the far hills, and Caleb's whole body went rigid, mid-sentence, his hand frozen on Rin's neck, his good ear turned toward the sound, the color draining out of a face that a moment before had almost looked alive. For 3 full seconds he was not in the hospital. Jessica watched a man relearn in real time that a noise was only a noise, and she understood with a quiet ache that he had been listening for that particular kind of bang for years, and that some part of him would be listening for it for the rest of his life. Then his shoulders came down. He blinked. Sorry, he said to the dog, not to her. Rin licked his wrist once, and the moment passed, and Jessica decided she was going to find Tomas Reyes, whether or not anyone in Washington thought he was worth a phone call. The Summit labor camp sat in a dusty bowl behind the orchards, 3 long bunkhouses and a gravel yard, one of them now a black, wet ruin roped off with caution tape. The foreman came out to meet her before she'd cleared the gate. Dwight Soto was a thin, jittery man in his 50s with a sunburned neck, a stained ball cap pulled low, and a habit of working a ring of keys around his belt that clattered when he was nervous, which seemed to be always. He had the wary, over-rehearsed politeness of a man who had decided cooperation was the fastest way to make the law go away. When she asked about Tomas Reyes, he barely paused. Walked off. They do that. Owed money, probably. Got scared. Hopped a ride. He said it too smoothly, the way you say a line you've practiced. When Jessica asked to see where Tomas had slept, Soto's keys went quiet in his hand, and that small silence told her more than his words had. There was a jacket left on a nail above an empty bunk, thin and oil-stained, and Jessica held it out to Rin and gave him the scent in a low voice. The dog took it in, then dropped his nose to the floor and went to work, and Jessica followed him out of the bunkhouse and across the gravel and down toward the lakeshore, with Soto trailing and protesting somewhere behind. Rin tracked steady and certain along a path worn through the weeds, past a fuel tank, past a row of idle equipment, all the way to a low-metal storage shed set back near the water with a heavy hasp on the door. There the dog stopped. He cast back and forth, working the air, and then he sat down hard in front of the shed and looked at Jessica, and the line of scent simply ended, the way a sentence ends when someone is interrupted. Whatever Tomas Reyes had been, his trail came here and stopped here, and a trail that stops does not mean a man walked away. Her phone rang as she stood there. Okonkwo. She already knew. He had seen her open queries on the databases, seen that she hadn't filed the closure, and his voice was tired rather than angry, which was worse. Ward, you were supposed to be home by now. She started to explain the dead child's name, the second badge, the missing worker, and he cut her off, not unkindly. I have a stack of cases with actual bodies and actual budgets. I cannot let a brand new agent build a RICO conspiracy out of one IRS letter and a dog with a feeling. The word feeling landed hard. Jessica looked at Rin, sitting rigid in front of a locked shed by a bright blue lake, and for the first time in her career, she did not say yes, sir. She said she needed 2 more days. There was a long pause on the line, the kind that costs something, and then he said, 2. Document everything. And hung up. She had just put her career on a dog's nose and a dead man's name. She got the shed open with Soto's reluctant key and a warning about liability. Inside it was dim and close and smelled of motor oil and something else, something she didn't want to name. Rin pushed in past her and went straight to the back corner and began to dig at a tarp, half buried under a heap of empty feed sacks. Jessica pulled it back. Beneath it, pressed into the dirt floor, was another laminated badge, charred at one corner like the first, and beside it a dark stain dried into the earth and a scuffed, wide drag mark leading toward the rear door. Not the stillness of a place someone had left. The chaos of a place someone had been taken from. Tomas Reyes had not walked off owing money. Someone had hurt him here, and then someone had moved him, and the drag mark meant that when they did, there had still been a reason to move him carefully. Jessica crouched in the oil dark with her hand over her mouth and let one thought rise clean and terrible above the rest. He might still be alive. The Veterans Appreciation Luncheon was held on the lawn behind the Aspenglow Resort, where the grass ran green and clipped down to a dock and Cobalt Lake threw the afternoon light back up at the white tents like something staged. There were folding chairs in neat rows, a banner strung between two cottonwoods that read, "We hire heroes," in the same white letters as the orchard gate, and a long table of donated food the church ladies guarded like a border. Jessica had not been invited so much as she had come, because watching a man in his natural habitat told you things no file could. She stood at the back with Rin sitting against her leg and watched Garrett Vance work the crowd. He was good at it. He was very good at it. Vance was 57 and built like a man who golfed and meant it, broad through the shoulders, trim at the waist, silver hair combed back from a tanned and pleasant face. He wore a navy quilted vest over a pressed shirt, clean boots that had never broken ground, and a fountain pen clipped to his pocket that caught the sun when he gestured. He moved through the rows of old soldiers, laying a hand on a shoulder here, crouching to speak at eye level with a man in a wheelchair there, and every face he touched softened toward him. When he took the small stage, he read a list of names of local veterans, slow and reverent, and let a silence sit after each one. And Jessica watched grown men wipe their eyes while he did it. He had learned somewhere that grief was a currency, and he had cornered the market on it in Larkspur. When the applause faded, he came straight for her, smiling, hand already extended, as if he'd been looking forward to this all day. Agent Ward. He knew her name. That was the first move, and she clocked it. "I have been hoping to thank you in person. You pulled one of my men out of that fire, Caleb." He pressed her hand in both of his, warm and dry. "Terrible thing, faulty wiring. We're sick about it. We're rebuilding the bunkhouse to code right now." He let a beat of sorrow pass over his face, then folded it away. "How is he? I worry about Caleb. He's a hero, truly, but the injuries he came back with." Vance lowered his voice to the register of a concerned friend. "The man loses time, Agent. He says things, mixes up years, places, people. We've covered 3 ER visits this year for episodes. I only mention it because I'd hate for anyone to take something he says in a confused moment and run somewhere unfortunate with it." It was beautifully done. He had thanked her, established his own generosity, and gutted her only witness, all in under a minute, all while smiling. Rin's lip lifted off his teeth without a sound, and Vance glanced down at the dog, and for just a flicker, something cold moved behind his eyes before the warmth came back over it like water closing. She drove away from that lawn with the shape of the money finally clear in her head. The dead were one engine, the heroes were the other. Vance hired disabled veterans under that banner, not in spite of their wounds, but because of them, because a service-connected disabled veteran was worth the richest federal hiring credit on the books, scaled to reported wages. Report enough wages, and the credit topped out near $10,000 a head. So Summit signed men like Caleb, put fictional wages on their records, claimed the maximum, and paid the men a fraction in cash. and because Summit held their papers for safekeeping and ran the mail through the camp office. They controlled the veterans' VA disability checks too, skimming the deposits of men too foggy or too beaten down to track their own accounts. The banner was not a kindness with a dark side. The banner was the bait. Every wounded man who walked under it was a line item. She brought what she could carry of it to Caleb that evening, not as an interrogation, but because he had earned the truth, and because she had nowhere else to put the weight of it. He listened from the hospital chair he'd insisted on moving to, Rin stretched across both their feet, like a warm bridge, and when she finished, he was quiet a long time. Then, in a voice scraped down to the bone, he told her the rest of his own. The building, the bad entry, the choice. There had been two ways to send the team and seconds to pick, and he had picked, and the way he picked was the way that killed his dog and two of his men, and left him breathing. The investigation had cleared him. Sound tactical judgment, the report said. He had read those clean words in a hospital not unlike this one, and understood that clean words do not raise the dead. After that I stopped, he said simply. Stopped reaching for people? If I don't reach, I can't pick wrong. He looked at his hands. Easier to be nothing than to be the man who chooses. Outside the window, a loon called once across the dark water, that long, rising tremolo that sounds almost like a person laughing and almost like a person grieving and is neither, and the sound hung in the room and stopped both of them mid-breath. And in the lamplight, Jessica saw that Caleb's eyes were wet and that he was letting them be, for the first time, in front of another living soul. The dog lifted his head at the cry, then settled it back across the man's ruined leg. For a moment, nobody tried to fix anything. The loon called again, farther off, and the night took it, and something in the room had shifted that neither of them would have known how to write down. So she told him about her father. She had never said it out loud to anyone in the bureau. How he had come home from his war carrying a weight he never set down, how it hollowed him by degrees over years while she was busy growing up and looking the other way. How one ordinary morning the weight had finally won, and she had driven across the city, too late and too fast, and arrived to a house gone quiet. How 4 days later, numb at a gas station, she'd heard a litter of abandoned pups in a box and found them all gone but one. I couldn't choose fast enough to save him either, she said. My dad. By the time I understood, it was already done. She put her hand on Rin's back. But I could save one runt of a dog. So I did, and I have spent 3 years thinking that was the whole story. She looked at Caleb. I'm starting to think Rin's been steering me somewhere the whole time. He pulled me off a recall command, off everything I trained into him, straight to a burning wall. To you? She didn't say the word destiny. She didn't have to. It sat in the room with the loon's echo and the smell of antiseptic and the warm weight of a dog who had refused from the very first week of his life to let either of these two broken people go under alone. The mood broke when Rin's head snapped toward the window and a growl rolled up out of him. The deep orchard fire growl, not the warning he'd shown Vance. A Summit equipment truck was rumbling past on the service road below, and the dog was on his feet at the glass, hackles up, fixed on it with absolute attention. Jessica went to the window. Diesel, she could smell it faintly even here, and under the diesel as the truck turned, she caught what the dog had caught first, the raw, mineral smell of fresh-turned earth riding in the bed of it. Rin was not reacting to the truck. He was reacting to where the truck had been and what it had been digging. She thought of a drag mark leading out a shed's rear door, and her stomach turned. The pressure came down fast after that, the way it does once the other side knows the clock is running. Bertie called the motel to report, scandalized, that Summit had crews out at the camp, cleaning up for the festival, hauling things off in the dark like raccoons, and that a county fellow had been by to say the burned bunkhouse would be demolished Monday for safety. Jessica understood the language. Vance was sterilizing the site under cover of civic tidiness, and the Cherry Festival, 2 days out, was the perfect noise to do it inside of. Soto would be the hands. the window that had been cracked open since the fire was closing, board by board, and she had perhaps 48 hours, and a supervisor who'd given her 2 days, and a witness, a rich man, was already calling crazy. She said as much to Caleb, not expecting anything, talking mostly to herself. And Caleb Mercer, who had told her an hour ago that he had stopped reaching for people because reaching meant choosing and choosing meant being wrong, pushed himself upright in the chair. Something had changed in his gray face, some old current coming back online behind the eyes. He had spent a year being nothing because nothing was safe. He looked at the dog who'd been his and wasn't, and at the woman who'd lost her father the same way the war had nearly lost him. And he made a choice out loud for the first time since a building came down on 3 lives in his hands. "I know where they put people," he said quietly, "when they need someone to disappear for a while. I've heard the trucks go there at night." He held her eyes. "I'm not running this time. Tell me what you need." By dusk, the waterfront had turned itself into a fairy tale. Paper lanterns hung in long strings between the cottonwoods, throwing pools of amber light down onto Cobalt Lake, and a string band sawed out something bright and old from the bandstand, while children ran through the crowd with cherry juice on their chins. The whole town smelled of kettle corn and wood smoke and the cold mineral breath of the water. Booths sold pie and preserves under the strung bulbs. On the main stage, Garrett Vance stood in a fresh navy vest with a microphone in his hand, telling Larkspur how proud he was to call it home. And the crowd loved him for it, and Jessica, watching from the edge of the lantern light with Rin pressed to her knee, understood that this was the most dangerous thing she had ever seen him do. He had put himself on a lit stage in front of 300 witnesses on the exact night his man was 3 miles away, sterilizing a crime scene. An alibi did not get cleaner than a microphone and a crowd. She had spent the afternoon failing to get a warrant. Okonkwo had listened longer than before, and she had heard him wanting to say yes, but a charred badge and a dog and a drag mark were not a judge's signature, and he would not send a green agent through a locked door on a feeling and a hope. "If you get something solid, real time, you call me and we move," he'd said. "Don't you go in there alone, Ward. I mean it." She had promised. She had meant it when she said it. Then Caleb, riding in her passenger seat against doctor's orders, with his splinted leg jammed into the footwell, had told her the trucks ran to the equipment yard north of the camp, the one near the water with the shipping containers, and that they ran at night, and that he had heard men knock on the inside of metal. And a worker's life was not a thing that waited for paperwork. The one piece of luck she got was a deputy named Marisol Okafor, the only county officer who picked up her phone on a festival night. Okafor was young, maybe 30, compact and unhurried, with her hair in a tight bun under her hat and the flat, steady voice of someone who had already decided she was not going to be impressed or rushed into anything stupid. She listened to Jessica's whole pitch leaning against her cruiser, arms crossed, and at the end of it she said only, "Exigent circumstances. Threat to life. Evidence about to be destroyed. That's a doorway, Federal. I'll walk through it with you, but it better be there." She did not sign on out of faith. She signed on because the law had a door in it for exactly this, and a missing man's blood in a shed was enough to put a careful officer's hand on the knob. They went in the dark, away from the lanterns, the 3 of them and the dog, up the service road with the festival noise falling away behind until there was only crickets and the lap of the lake and Rin's claws ticking on the gravel. The equipment yard sat black against the water, a half-dozen shipping containers in a row, a dozer parked with its blades still caked in fresh earth. There was a light moving in one of the bunkhouses across the way, and the smell of accelerant on the air, paper and diesel, a man in a hurry, burning things. Jessica put the worker's jacket to Rin's nose one more time and breathed the command, and the dog dropped his head and went, threading between the containers with absolute purpose, and stopped dead at the 3rd one, and sat, and from inside it, faint, came the sound Caleb had described, a knuckle against steel. Then the festival's first firework broke over the lake behind them, a white concussion that lit the whole yard, stark as noon for half a second, and threw their four shadows long across the dirt. And in that sudden flash, Jessica saw the scratch marks gouged low on the container door, fingernails on paint. And the flash died, and the dark slammed back, and the boom rolled across the water. A beat late, and under its cover close by, a man's voice swore, and a jerrican clanked, and every one of them understood at the same instant that the burning had already started, and they had walked in on the last few minutes of it. Nobody breathed. Then Okafor said, "Go," very quietly. And they went. The lock was a cheap hasp, and Caleb took it apart with a pry bar from the dozer faster than a whole man could have, and when the door swung the smell rolled out, sweat and waste and fear, and inside in the dark were four people, Tomas Reyes among them, gaunt and split-lipped and squinting at the firework light, his wrist bound, alive. The container beside theirs was already going up, flames climbing the seam between the two, and the steel between was getting hot, and the easy way out, the wide, clear lane between the containers back toward the road, ran right past the burning one. Caleb started them that way on instinct, the fast way, the obvious way. And Rin spun and threw himself across the lane, snarling, blocking it with his body the exact way he had blocked nothing else in 3 years, and he would not move, and Jessica had learned by now what it cost her never to listen. "Other way," she said. "Trust the dog." 3 seconds after they backed out of that lane, the burning container's door blew off its hinges on a gout of flame and landed flat across the very ground they would have been crossing. The dog had read the fire through a wall of steel. The dog had been right. What happened next, Jessica would not be able to put cleanly in a report, because some of it happened in a place reports cannot reach. Caleb went into that smoke. The man who had told her 2 nights ago that he had stopped reaching for people because reaching meant choosing wrong, went back into fire, and choosing, and this time his body knew exactly what to do with it. He got Tomas up over his good shoulder and pointed the other two toward Okafor's voice, and he did not freeze, did not go gray and distant, did not disappear into the building that had come down on him years ago. He moved like the man he had been before the world taught him to be nothing. Jessica stayed at the gap with Rin, calling the low, steady words she'd trained into the dog, and found herself saying to the man too, eyes on me, this way, and one by one they came out of the smoke toward her voice, coughing, staggering, alive, all of them, every single one. They had Soto before he made his truck. He came around the bunkhouse with a jerrican still in his hand and the firelight on his face, and he simply stopped when he saw Okafor's weapon and the agent and the dog and the people he'd locked in the box standing in the open air breathing, and something in the thin, nervous man folded all at once. He was not built for this. He had been built to clatter his keys and look away. He went down to his knees in the gravel before anyone told him to, and the words came pouring out of him faster than Okafor could caution him through them. Vance's name first and most often, the trucks, the orders, the credits, the men told to disappear. "I never killed anybody. He said, move them. He said, clean it. I just did the work." Jessica crouched in front of him while Okafor radioed it in for real this time, units rolling, and told him to slow down and say it again from the start, and he did. By the time they walked Soto back down toward the lights, the festival was at its peak, the band loud, the lake throwing back great blooming flowers of red and gold as the fireworks climbed and burst over the water. Tomas was wrapped in a blanket beside an ambulance, alive enough to give her a name and a nod. She had it all now, the living witness and the dead boy's badge, and the blood in the shed and the foreman on his knees. And it had cost her 2 days she didn't have, and a career she'd bet on, a runt's nose. She brought Soto through the edge of the crowd in cuffs, and that was where Garrett Vance was, stepping down off the stage into the applause, smile wide, hand already rising to wave. He saw the deputy. He saw Soto. He saw Jessica. And then his eyes went down to Ryn, who had moved without a sound to stand square in the gap between Vance and Jessica, hackles up, amber eyes fixed on the man's pleasant face. And for the first time since she had laid eyes on him under that banner, the smile on Garrett Vance's face caught and slipped, and for one bright firework-lit instant, the thing underneath it showed all the way through. The investigation did not arrive like the firework had. It arrived like weather, slow and total, in sedans with government plates and men in windbreakers who measured dozer tracks and bagged feed sacks and asked the same questions 4 different ways until the lies got tired of standing up. Jessica's parking ticket case became, in the space of a week, a federal task force. The FBI ran the identity theft and the forced labor counts. Homeland Security investigations took the trafficking and the visa fraud. The Department of Labor's Inspector General pulled the wage records apart thread by thread. And IRS criminal investigation followed the money, because the money was where Garrett Vance had always been most honest about who he was. The agent who came up from the field office to run it was a heavy-set, soft-spoken man named Art Pelletier, near retirement, with reading glasses pushed up into thin gray hair and the unhurried manner of someone who had watched 100 clever men talk themselves into prison. He read Jessica's file twice, looked at the dog asleep under her chair, and said only, 2 days, 1 agent, and a shepherd. Huh. It was, from a man like that, a decoration. The evidence stacked up the way truth does once it stops being buried, in pieces that did not look like much alone and looked like a life sentence together. The Social Security numbers of dead children and dead men on Summit's payroll, Danny Castellanos among them, and 11-year-olds among them, attached to laborers who could now be interviewed in safety. The WOTC filings with their beautiful fictional wages, claiming the maximum federal credit for disabled veterans who had been paid in cash and kept in a bunkhouse. The held documents recovered from the camp office in a banker's box, passports and IDs filed alphabetically like a librarian's nightmare. Tomas Reyes's statement, and then 4 more, and then 11, as workers learned the man with the keys was in a cell and could not reach them. Soto's phone, which he had been too frightened to wipe, full of texts that said, "Move them and clean it up in one," dated the morning after the shed. That said, "Is the Reyes problem handled?" And the VA deposits, rerouted and skimmed, including the monthly check that should have gone to a man named Caleb Mercer and had instead gone, for a year, into an account Garrett Vance controlled. Vance did not fall the way men fall in the stories Birdie's customers liked to tell each other afterward. There was no confession on the courthouse steps, no breakdown, no moment of grace. He hired 3 lawyers from the city the same afternoon his accounts were frozen and put out a statement so smooth it could have been poured. There had been a misunderstanding. Summit Labor Solutions remained committed to Larkspur and to the responsible stewardship of its workforce. Certain disgruntled former employees and an overzealous junior agent had constructed a narrative. The land was private. The future of the town's economy hung, he reminded everyone gently, on people not rushing to judgment. He believed, he said, that he would be fully vindicated. Jessica read it standing at the counter of the Blue Heron, and Bertie read it over her shoulder, wiping a plate dry, and when she got to the part about responsible stewardship of its workforce, she set the plate down and said, "Responsible stewardship. That's what a fox calls the hen house when the inspector comes by." And Jessica laughed, a real one, surprising herself, the first time the sound had come out of her in what felt like a month. It did not fix anything. It loosened something, which was different and maybe better. A church bell rang out across the water then, the noon bell from the white steeple on the far shore, 3 clear strokes that carried over the lake and through the open cafe door. And for no reason Jessica could have named the sound, stopped her cold with the dish towel still in her hand. Because it was an ordinary bell on an ordinary day in a town that had been about to lose itself and hadn't. And she understood standing there that this was what winning actually felt like. Not a verdict, not a headline, just a bell over water and a town allowed to keep being a town. Bertie watched her face and said nothing, and let the bell finish, and then poured her more coffee because Bertie had buried enough people to know that the quiet moments were the ones that did the real lifting. The summons would not let Summit reopen. The assets stayed frozen. The workers were moved into real housing and real protection while the case ground on toward the years of trial it would take, because money like that did not surrender. It litigated. Pelletier was honest with her about it. He'll fight every count. Men like him always think the next motion is the one that saves them. But the machine had stopped running. That was the thing. Whatever happened in the courtrooms 2 years out, no one else was going to wake in that bunkhouse under that banner and disappear into a metal box by the water. The engine that ran on people nobody would miss had been switched off, and it had been switched off because somebody had finally missed somebody. She drove out to Ruth Castellanos double-wide on a bright morning with a single sheet of paper in a folder. And this was the errand she had not known 3 weeks ago that she was being sent to Larkspur to run. The letter was from the Social Security Administration. It confirmed that the fraudulent earnings attached to the record of Daniel Castellano, deceased, had been identified, flagged, and removed, that the account had been corrected, that the dead man would be permitted, at last, to stay dead. Ruth read it at her sunflower table with her glasses down on her nose and her lips moving, and then she read it again, and then she folded it along its creases with hands that had filed 31 years of other people's paper, and she held it against the front of her cardigan. "One piece of paper took my boy from me twice," she said, not looking up. "This one gives back what a piece of paper can." She looked at Jessica over the glasses. "It isn't him. You know that." "I know," Jessica said. "Then we'll treat it like what it is," Ruth said, and set it down very carefully, like communion, beside Danny's grinning photograph. Something. Caleb came back by inches, the way Ryn had once told her people heal, not in a sunrise but in a count of small things. His name came clean first, the fraudulent wages stripped off his record, the credits clawed back. Then the VA money started flowing to the right account, a year of it recovered, enough for a room over the hardware store with a window that faced the lake instead of a wall. He got fitted for a better prosthetic through a veterans program Pelletier knew about. He started taking a few shifts at the marina, fixing motors, work his hands remembered. He was not fixed. He still turned his head the wrong way to listen, still went gray and far off when a truck door slammed, still had mornings the years came unstuck. But he reached for things now. That was the change you could see. He had decided to be the man who chooses, and to carry the cost of it, which was the only kind of healing Jessica had ever actually believed in. What stayed with her after the task force packed up and the headlines moved on was not the size of the case or the line it would draw under her name in the bureau. It was how ordinary the evil had looked the whole time. Garrett Vance had not hidden in a cave. He had stood under a banner with the word heroes on it and read the names of the dead aloud and let the town love him while he sold the living by the head. The thing that had nearly swallowed Larkspur wore a clean vest and carried a silver pen and said, somewhere at the beginning of all of it, just this once, the paperwork will catch up. It frightened her more than any monster would have, because a monster you could see coming, and Vance you would have voted for. On her last morning she sat with Caleb on the dock behind the marina, while the lake went to glass and the mountains stood upside down in it. Ryn lay between them, 3 years old and gray, already coming in early, at his muzzle from a life that had asked a lot of him, his head on his paws, his amber eyes half closed and aimed at the water. For a long while none of them said anything, and Caleb did not once look at the door of the marina behind them, did not track the exits, did not listen for the bad news over his shoulder. He just sat. After a time he took out the worn dog tag he had carried in his breast pocket through every town and every bad night, Argo stamped into the soft metal, and he held it a moment, and then he laid it down on the dock next to the brass tag on Ryn's new collar, so the two of them touched, the dog that had died for him and the dog that had pulled a stranger out of the fire to find him. He let them lie there together in the sun. Then gently, without grief breaking over him the way it once had, he picked Argo's tag back up and put it away. The name was his to honor. It was not going to be his leash anymore. Rin lifted his head, looked at the man, and set it back down against his leg, and the lake held all three of them right side up and upside down at once, and the morning kept its light a long time. Maybe you noticed it too, the way this whole story turned on something small. A week-old runt in a taped-up box behind a gas station. A dog nobody would have blamed Jessica for leaving there. And yet, that one act of mercy, done on the worst week of her life, grew into the thing that pulled a forgotten soldier out of the fire, gave a grieving mother back her son's name, and freed people who had been treated as if they could disappear without anyone noticing. We like to think rescue is something heroes do in a single dramatic moment. More often, it is something quiet we set in motion long before, on a day we felt too broken to save anyone, including ourselves. That is how grace tends to work, not as a thunderclap, but as a hand reaching down through the smoke when we have run out of our own strength. Jessica could not save her father. Caleb could not save the men he lost. Neither of them got the miracle they would have asked for. But God has a way of taking the love we have left over from the people we couldn't save and putting it exactly where it can still do good. Sometimes that love arrives on four legs, with steady amber eyes, refusing to let us go under alone. The Bible tells us that a righteous man cares for the life of his animal, and there is a reason for that. How we treat the creatures who depend on us, the ones who cannot repay us or speak for themselves, says everything about the kind of heart we are building. So here is the lesson worth carrying out of Larkspur and into your own ordinary day. Be kind to the small thing in front of you, even when you cannot fix the big thing breaking your heart. Feed the stray. Sit with the neighbor everyone else has given up on. Notice the person who has gone quiet, the veteran at the end of the counter, the old woman who keeps writing letters. No one answers. Evil rarely shows up with horns. It shows up in a clean vest, smiling, saying just this once, counting on the rest of us to look away. The cure for that is not suspicion. It is people who refuse to stop seeing each other, who refuse to let a single soul become someone nobody would miss. If this story moved you tonight, take a moment to share it with someone who needs to be reminded that their kindness still matters. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. And if you have a rescued dog or cat lying near you right now, tell us their name, because every one of those names is a small light. Subscribe and stay with us for the next story of loyalty, courage, and second chances. And may God bless you and keep you. May He watch over your family, your home, and every faithful creature under your roof, and may He place the right small light on your path exactly when you need it most. Good night, and peace be with you.